Continuing on with Chapter 7, we're looking at the creation of an American empire through imperialism from 1890 to 1909. Now, we're right in the middle of the Spanish-American War, fighting in Cuba, fighting in the Philippines, and soon to be fighting in Puerto Rico as well. Now, back to Cuba, where we already talked about. The American Navy is focusing its attention on the Spanish Navy, obviously, as led by Admiral Cervera, who was stationed at Santiago. So the goal here is to surround Santiago's forces, to create an American naval blockade outside of Santiago Harbor, and then also land American troops, led by General William Shafter, my favorite character in American history, and have his troops march overland to surround them on land as well. So the U.S. strategy, like I said, led by General William Shafter, to land at Guantanamo Bay and then move overland to surround him at Santiago. We were unprepared for this war. We have wool uniforms for battling the Native Americans out west. It was a very hurriedly put together battle plan. 17,000 men just haphazardly being thrown onto transports down in Tampa and shipped over to Cuba in the summer of 1898. Now, one group that is very popular during the Spanish-American War, and were written about ad nauseum by the yellow journalism of the day, were the Rough Riders. Their official name were 1st Cavalry Volunteers. Teddy Roosevelt, when the war was started, resigned his post at the Navy Department to become a lieutenant colonel, and he created this 1st Cavalry Volunteers, or popularly referred to as the Rough Riders, from groups of people all over the United States that he had met during his hodgepodge life. People from Harvard, cowboys from out west, convicts, etc. And they're very popular in the day, and this is where Teddy Roosevelt really becomes very well known nationally, which is obviously going to help lead to him being named as vice president and then taking over as president later on. So, in June of 1898, Shafter landed at Guantanamo Bay, faced a very disorganized Spanish army, and begins moving toward Santiago. At the battles of El Caney and San Juan Hill in July of 1898, the Rough Riders make their charge up San Juan Hill to capture the high ground from the Spanish. This is very popular, and in this case assisted by the Gatling gun, which allowed them to take the high ground, unlike in past battles that we've seen before. Here is General Shafter, my favorite guy because he is so large and in charge on his horse. Here is the battle plan in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, a very small area of operations. Here you see the troop movement from Tampa down to Cuba. Here you see Teddy Roosevelt with his Rough Riders. And the yellow journalism of the day depicting Teddy Roosevelt very gallantly charging and leading his men up San Juan Hill. So this is a very, very short war, but it's going to have a lot of a large impact on the United States. Cervera wanted to withdraw his very ill-prepared navy, but he was ordered to continue fighting on. And in the end, all Spanish ships were destroyed. 500 Spanish ships, or 500 Spanish sailors, compared to just one American dead. He had no choice but to surrender Santiago to the Americans. The Navy from here, they've succeeded in Cuba, attacked Puerto Rico, another colony owned by Spain at this time, on May 12th in 1898. Here the American Army forces were led by General Nelson Miles with a force of 3,300 men. Obviously, they were welcomed as liberators by the Puerto Ricans, similar to what we saw with the Cubans, similar to what we saw with the Filipinos. And eventually, an armistice would be called. The major killers during this war was not the Spanish. It was disease from the tropics. Malaria, typhoid, dysentery, yellow fever. These are the major killers, and forced 80% of the men to be evacuated in order to go back to Long Island to recovery. In the end, only about 500 men died in action, 5,000 from disease. So, like I said, this war was called to an end, or a cease fighting was called in August of 1898. A very short war, just a couple of months. And so in order to bring an end to this war, they went back to Paris again to have yet another Treaty of Paris to end the Spanish-American War. In this treaty, Cuba was relinquished along with Guam and Puerto Rico. But the issue is over the Philippines. The armistice was called on one day, and it wasn't until the very next day that the Spanish in the Philippines surrendered. So there is this technicality that the Philippines actually didn't fall to the United States until after the armistice was called. And so we didn't know what to do with the Philippines at this time. The American missionaries, the Christian missionaries, and businessmen were pushing to buy the Philippines. They saw it as a great place to bring Christianity. They saw it as a great place to open up to American markets, to sell all those industrial products that are coming out of the United States at this time. And here is Uncle Sam, obviously depicted as a jingo on board an American warship. But not everyone is all gung-ho about taking control of the Philippines. This is a very large Asian population. They're very far away. Many people felt that they were unassimilatable, meaning they would never come to the American culture. They would never give in. And how are we going to force them? They're so far away and there's such a large population. The Anti-Imperialist League was formed at this time to fight against the annexation of the Philippines. Many of the notable members, Henry James, Mark Twain, Samuel Gompers, Andrew Carnegie, these were some of the major guys involved in the Anti-Imperialist League. Many of them felt that annexation of the Philippines went against our creed of consent of the governed. The Filipinos wanted their independence. They didn't want the United States to take control. And also from a business perspective, they were a threat to American business. So many people felt that we would be spread too thin if we took over the Philippines. And so there is this debate. Should we annex? Should we not annex? Is it really our, quote, white man's burden to take over the Philippines or any of these places? But back to that business standpoint, these are markets and there are natural resources that we could take from the Philippines to use in business. So, the Treaty of Paris was eventually helped to be passed by William Jennings Bryan, even though William Jennings Bryan was an anti-imperialist, which we'll talk more about later on. But he didn't think that the Filipinos could achieve their freedom until this treaty was settled. He felt that the issue with imperialism in the Philippines was a separate issue. Now, Puerto Rico was not so lucky. Puerto Rico is now going to be controlled by the United States, hence why Puerto Rico is a territory today. Now that we have very quickly, overnight, become a colonizing power, we have to now deal with Puerto Rico. 1 million people down in Puerto Rico lived in poverty. And how are we going to create an infrastructure down in Puerto Rico to help assimilate these people and to help govern these people? Congress passed the Foraker Act in 1900 to give Puerto Rico some popular government, but not necessarily citizenship rights. That doesn't come till 1917. And there is this question, all these new territories that we are acquiring, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, which we're going to buy, do they get American citizenship because now that we own them? And so the Supreme Court ruled in what becomes commonly referred to as the insular cases, insular referring to islands, when the question says, does the Constitution follow the flag? Are they guaranteed the same rights that the Constitution gives citizens of the United States simply because we have planted our flag in their soil? The Supreme Court ruled no, that these new territories don't necessarily receive the rights of other United States citizens. There's no mention of colonies in the Constitution. So we're kind of making this stuff up as we go along. So after this war is over, remember, Congress had passed that Teller Amendment prior to the start of the war. But there's a lot to be dealt with at Cuba before we allow them to have their independence. The United States set up a military government down in Cuba to be led by General Leonard Wood until a time that they could take over their own government. With the help of Dr. Walter Reed, which there's a medical hospital named after him, they helped to eradicate yellow fever, which had been such a big problem during the Spanish-American War. And by 1902, the United States felt that Cuba was ready to have their independence, that we were going to abide by that Teller Amendment and give them their independence, as long as Cuba abided by two things, and we required these two things before we would let them have their independence. First and foremost, Cuba had to write the Platt Amendment into their constitution before they could be given their freedom. The Platt Amendment guaranteed the United States the right to intervene in Cuba any time we deemed necessary, if we needed to restore order. It also said that Cuba was not allowed to transfer land to anyone but the United States unless we agreed to it. This had to be written into Cuba's constitution before they could have their independence. So from a Cuban perspective, this doesn't really seem like that great of an independence if Big Brother, the United States, is always watching. We also required that the United States would lease Guantanamo Bay for a very long time, which the United States still controls today, even with all of the issues that we currently have down in Cuba. So, the Spanish-American War was 113 days long, or as many of the jingos of the day called it, the splendid little war. It was very, very short amount of time, low casualties compared to other wars that we've fought, but a very big payout. We got a lot of colonial power out of this, a lot of markets and other stuff that we did not have prior to this. The United States is now a world power. We're proving our naval power, just like Alfred Thayer Mahan said that we should. American jingoism is at an all-time high, but at the same time, there is a growing suspicion among Latin America towards the United States. We are going to see a downturn in American-Latin American relations for a pretty long time, pretty much up until FDR during this period of time, because the United States had promised their freedom to a lot of these countries and they weren't necessarily getting it. But what it does do is help to heal that divide between North and South, that for the first time since the Civil War, Northerners and Southerners were working together to fight against a common enemy. Here is the American eagle spreading its wings from all the way down in the Philippines all the way to Puerto Rico, and compare that to 1798, 10,000 miles from tip to tip. Now, the Philippines, even though they were not given their independence, we ended up paying $20 million to buy the Philippines because of that little blip on the radar that we weren't sure who was in charge at the end of the war. They're very angry over their lack of independence, especially since the Filipinos had helped lead to a victory for the United States against the Spanish. And so immediately after the Spanish-American War is over and the United States is trying to figure out what it's going to do with all of their new colonies, a new war erupts between these Filipino guerrilla warriors and the United States, led by our old ally, Emilio Aguinaldo. They wanted their independence just like Cuba had been given. The anti-imperialists of the day are saying, see, this is what we told you. Why are we forcing colonization on these people? Whatever happened to that idea of self-determination? We are denying it to these people. But instead, because there is so much profit to gain from controlling a country like the Philippines, this warfare turns pretty gruesome pretty quickly. The Filipinos engage in guerrilla warfare against the Americans. They didn't necessarily have the resources that the American army did, but they did know the terrain. They do know how to hit and run. And so the Americans turn around and create reconcentration camps against the Filipinos, using torture to force submission, exactly what the Spanish had been doing against the Cubans that had been so horrible to us before. Things like water torture until the Filipinos gave in, or obviously until they died. Eventually, this revolution came to an end in 1901 when Emilio Aguinaldo was captured, but not before 600,000 Filipinos were killed during the Philippine-American War. And following this Philippine-American War, this uprising against the new colonizing power, the United States, the Philippine Commission was established in 1899 by William McKinley to study this issue and to make recommendations. How are we going to deal with the Philippines? This commission was headed up by the future president, William Howard Taft, who called the Filipinos his, quote, little brown brothers. And he said that the best way to assimilate the Filipinos is to improve their education, improve their infrastructure, their sanitation, their public health, get them on our side, and to someday promise someday you will have independence, which did occur on July 4th, 1946.